Australia has been transformed and had an influence by the Europeans and how they first established and settled in Australia. The changes in Australia between 1750 and 1918 were significantly dramatic. During this harsh time, the changes were social, cultural, economic and political. Including the British, sought to live on Australian shores. There are many reasons why Australia was a changing nation during this time. There were key developments that led to the British expansion in Australia in 1788. In Britain at this time, the British Parliament accepted the abolition of slave trade, so instead they put them in prisons, which led to overcrowding prisons. Britain transported convicts from its overcrowding prisons to Australian penal colonies. This formed the basis of the first migration from Europe to Australia. Settlement and expansion of Australia was a confronting experience, not just for the British, but also the Aboriginal people. When the British arrived in their ships in Australia, they were astounded that people were already there. British authorities believed they were legally entitled to occupy the land and set up a permanent jail. The majority of the convicts who were transported to Australia were poor and illiterate. When the convicts arrived, it was a tough situation to be in, as they had no food. They were sick, with no houses to live in. The first impressions of Australia were not good. It was considered a hot and dry country. Settlement in Australia had a massive impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Interactions between Europeans and Indigenous people were not good because the Aboriginal people didn't like the Europeans taking their land away from them. Aboriginal people were forced to live in townships where British officials controlled their daily life. As the settlement started to grow, so did the exposure to different diseases, such as smallpox, TB, influenza, measles, whooping cough, and the common cold. The European treatment of sacred sites was horrible. There was a lack of respect shown for Indigenous Australians, and this affected the relationships in Australia. The working and living conditions were horrible during the settlement and the Federation. All workers received a very little pay, their health was poor and many people died from dysentery. The working conditions in Australia was very hard. The men were responsible for looking after the family and the women's job was to cook, clean and look after the children. Many of the convicts were miners, traders, farmers, teachers and doctors. Children were also expected to work at the age of 8. There was very little entertainment for the convicts besides board games, but they were able to listen to the radio. For the rich, there was horse riding, musicals, pleasure gardens and movie houses. There was a definite class difference in Australia, and some people enjoyed a higher status than others. This also led to conflict and relationship issues in Australia at this time. The experience for non-Europeans in Australia was shocking. Chinese arriving in Australia were the largest group of Asian settlers in Australia. Many Chinese immigrants were political refugees escaping from conflict in their countries. Many of the Chinese workers were miners. The Chinese people were often viewed with suspicion by the Europeans because they worked for less pay and worked long hours. They were also accused of introducing exotic drugs and they were often victims of prejudice and racial abuse. Non-Chinese people who were miners attacked the Chinese camp, burning tents, their positions, hitting, whipping and cutting off their pigtails. Before the Federation of Australia, all of the states and territories each had its own law and their own separate army. A politician called Henry Parkes was pushing to get rid of the division and combine all the states together. Made an impact, but Western Australia didn't like the idea of this. At the time, the economy wasn't doing very well. There was a fight over which state should be the capital of Australia. This created more conflict in Australia. The legislation between 1901 and 1914 affected the living and work conditions of Australia. The White Australia policy led to the restriction of non-European migration. There was never any specific policy titled such, but the term was invented later to describe a collection of policies that were designed to exclude people who were not Australian. This was one of the first laws to be passed by the new Australian Parliament. This led to workers getting less wages and that led to conflict in the penal colonies. The Immigration Restriction Act in 1901 was an act of the Parliament of Australia which limited immigration to Australia. Workers' compensation was a scheme to provide payments to the Commonwealth employees who suffered a work-related injury. People who were sick received a pension. This was below an average wage, but it was enough to afford the basics. This had a positive impact on those people who were unable to work. White Australian people believed that they were in some way superior to non-Aboriginals and non-Europeans. The White Australia policy created a division, and during this time, Australia only had one culture. Furthermore, Australia was transformed between 1750 and 1918. The changes were social, political, cultural and economical. Laws and policies affected the status and living and working conditions of groups in Australia. This presentation has outlined significant changes in Australia. This has affected the future of Australia, culture, citizens' communication, transport technology, education and housing.
created using Powtoon.